On July 1st, the last American B-52 Stratofortress lifted off from RAF Fairford in England and headed home, closing out a deployment that had spent months pounding Iranian targets. All 6 bombers left in 2 separate waves, caught on camera by local aviation photographers as they climbed out over the English countryside for the final time. For anyone tracking this war closely, that departure looked like exactly what it was designed to look like, a signal that Washington was quietly stepping back, giving diplomacy room to breathe while negotiators shuttled between Doha and Muscat, trying to hammer out an actual end to the fighting. Iranian officials, publicly and privately, treated that drawdown as proof their negotiating position was working, that months of resistance and retaliation had finally forced the United States to blink first. And then, just over a month later, on the first weekend of August, American officials confirmed a plan was fully built and ready to execute for what President Trump himself called the biggest attack since World War II. A strike specifically targeting Iran's energy infrastructure, locked, loaded, and scheduled to happen within hours before it got called off at the very last second. That whiplash, from bombers quietly going home to the biggest strike of the entire war sitting on the runway ready to launch, is the entire story we need to unpack today, because it tells you everything about how little the appearance of American withdrawal has actually meant throughout this conflict, and how dangerous it's been for Iran to read a temporary pause as an actual victory. To understand why the B-52 specifically has become such a critical barometer for how this war has actually been going, you have to go back to how this aircraft got involved in the first place. The B-52H Stratofortress isn't a stealth aircraft. It doesn't have anything close to the low, observable profile of the B-2 Spirit that carried out the original strikes on Fordo and Natanz. What it has, instead, is raw capacity. It can carry close to 70,000 pounds of ordnance in a single sortie, second only to the B-1B Lancer in the entire American bomber fleet, and it can fly nearly 9,000 miles without needing to refuel, a range that lets it circle the entire globe if it has to. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, confirmed on March 31st that American forces had begun overland bombing missions over Iran using the B-52H, it marked a deliberate shift away from the earlier phase of the war, which had relied primarily on standoff cruise missiles and precision strikes from stealth platforms. That shift only became possible because, by that point, more than 11,000 targets had already been struck across Iran, and a significant portion of the country's radar and integrated air defense network had been degraded to the point where flying a large, non-stealth bomber directly over Iranian territory no longer carried the same catastrophic risk it would have carried in the war's opening weeks. Once that threshold was crossed, the B-52 became the workhorse of the entire campaign, because it could deliver a higher volume of munitions per sortie at a lower cost than repeatedly firing expensive standoff missiles, giving American commanders the ability to sustain continuous strike cycles against Iran's remaining missile sites, storage facilities, and command infrastructure night after night. It's worth tracing the full arc of how B-52s got wrapped up in this conflict in the first place, because the aircraft's presence in the region long predates the war itself and tells you how deliberately the Pentagon has used these bombers as a signaling tool from the very beginning. Back in January, before major combat operations had even officially started, B-52s were already being surged to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar as tensions with Iran were escalating, a deployment explicitly framed at the time as a warning shot, a way of telling Tehran that overwhelming American air power could be brought to bear at essentially any moment the administration chose. That's the same basic playbook the Pentagon has used for years whenever a crisis with Iran starts heating up, moving B-52s forward specifically because the optics of a nuclear-capable strategic bomber landing in the region carry a very different message than moving fighter jets or destroyers, which happen constantly regardless of tension levels. Then, in early March, additional B-1 Lancers arrived at Fairford after the UK reversed an earlier refusal and granted access for strikes on Iranian missile sites, a policy shift that itself had caused visible friction with the Trump administration before London ultimately came around. By the time full-scale war broke out at the end of February, the region was already saturated with exactly this kind of heavy bomber presence, positioned and ready well before the first shots were fired, which tells you the military buildup wasn't a reaction to the war starting. It was one of the conditions that made the scale of the opening campaign possible in the first place. That sustained bombing campaign is exactly what Iran's negotiators were trying to bring to an end throughout the spring and into the summer, and for a while, it genuinely looked like they were making real progress. Back in early July, Trump himself said publicly that indirect talks with Iran happening in Qatar were making progress, describing it as a tentative but real sign that diplomacy was holding even after recent exchanges of fire had threatened to blow the whole process apart. Those talks were happening under Qatari and Pakistani mediation, a specific channel that had become the primary venue for trying to translate an earlier memorandum of understanding, when both governments had technically signed on into something resembling an actual lasting ceasefire. The state of that diplomacy throughout the summer has been genuinely described by people tracking it closely as murky at best, with both sides continuing to trade smaller strikes even while talks were ongoing, which tells you the memorandum itself was never a clean, fully honored agreement so much as a loose framework. Both sides kept bending and occasionally outright breaking, depending on what was happening on the ground that particular week. But even with all that instability baked in, the physical withdrawal of the B-52 fleet from Fairford felt like a genuinely concrete signal, precisely because moving heavy bombers isn't something militaries do casually or symbolically. Basing them forward at Fairford in the first place had been a deliberate operational choice, one that dramatically cut down flight times, reduced wear and tear on both aircraft and crews, and allowed for a much higher sortie generation rate than flying missions all the way from bases inside the continental United States. Pulling that entire fleet back home in 2 visible waves, at the exact moment negotiators were meeting in Doha, was read by nearly everyone watching, including apparently officials inside Iran itself, as Washington's clearest tangible gesture, yet that it was serious about giving the diplomatic track real room to work. But here's what makes this story genuinely important to understand, because the reality sitting just underneath that visible signal was far less reassuring than the optics suggested. At the exact same time, those bombers were quietly leaving Britain, reporting citing American officials directly involved in internal discussions revealed that President Trump had been holding multiple private conversations with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and General Kane specifically about resuming full-scale strikes on Iran. According to that same reporting, Trump had genuinely weighed a full return to all-out war during this exact window, the same window Iran was treating as evidence of American de-escalation, and had simply decided, for the moment, to stick with diplomatic talks instead of pulling that trigger. That distinction matters enormously. The bombers leaving Fairford wasn't a strategic decision to abandon the military option. It was a logistical repositioning that happened to coincide with a president who was actively debating whether to escalate dramatically further, choosing day by day to hold off rather than commit. Iran's negotiators, and likely much of Iran's broader government, appear to have read the visible signal, empty tarmac at a British airbase, as the real story, when the actual decision-making happening behind closed doors in Washington was a much closer call than anyone on the outside could see. That gap between the visible signal and the private deliberation is exactly what exploded into public view on the first weekend of August. According to Trump's own account, confirmed by multiple people familiar with the planning, the United States had a fully built strike package ready to execute against Iran's energy infrastructure. A strike he described in no uncertain terms as bigger than anything the country had launched against Iran throughout this entire 5-month war, invoking the framing of the biggest attack since World War II. This wasn't a rhetorical exaggeration layered on top of a routine strike package. This was, by every account of the planning that's emerged, a real, fully resourced military operation sitting ready to launch, targeting the actual economic infrastructure that keeps the Iranian government functioning, not just its military assets. And it was called off only at the very last moment, after Saudi Arabia's crown prince, along with leadership in Qatar and the UAE, personally reached out to Trump directly, warning that an attack of that scale risked triggering economic shockwaves far beyond the immediate conflict, and after Iran itself, through back channels, asked for the same pause. Trump has been explicit that the option remains ready to go whenever he decides to use it. That's the part Iranian negotiators, and anyone celebrating the earlier bomber withdrawal as a genuine turning point, needs to sit with carefully, because it means the entire infrastructure for exactly the kind of massive escalation that left England back in July had clearly been rebuilt, resourced, and readied again within a matter of weeks, sitting on a hair trigger the whole time, regardless of what the diplomatic track appeared to be accomplishing. It's worth pausing here to actually think through why heavy bombers specifically function as such a revealing signal in a conflict like this one, because it explains why so many analysts have spent months treating aircraft movements as a more honest barometer of the war's direction than any official government statement. A country's diplomats can say whatever serves the moment, talks are progressing, a deal is imminent, both sides are showing good faith, none of which costs anything to say, and none of which is independently verifiable in real time. Moving a fleet of nuclear-capable long-range strategic bombers, on the other hand, is an enormously visible, resource-intensive undertaking that shows up immediately on flight tracking data, gets photographed by aviation enthusiasts standing outside the base with a camera, and can't be quietly reversed without someone noticing. That's precisely why outside observers, including the very defense analysts who track this war for a living, have repeatedly pointed to what the Air Force actually does with its bomber fleet, rather than what officials say in press briefings, as the more reliable indicator of where negotiations are actually heading. And by that exact standard, the pattern over the last several months has been genuinely alarming for anyone hoping this war is winding down in a straight line. Bombers arrive in force when tensions spike, following months of exactly that pattern going back to the initial buildup in January, when B-52s were first surged to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar amid escalating tensions, then again in March when additional B-1s arrived at Fairford after the UK reversed an earlier policy refusal and granted access for strikes on Iranian missile sites. They ramp up operational tempo during active combat phases, as they did once overland bombing began on March 31st. And then they quietly withdraw when a diplomatic opening appears, only to have the entire infrastructure for their return rebuilt and readied again within weeks, as we just watched happen heading into August. That's not a story about a war winding down. That's a story about a war that keeps oscillating between active combat and armed pause, with the American military maintaining the full capability to snap back to maximum pressure. At any point, the president decides the moment calls for it. There's another layer to this worth understanding, which is how the different bomber types themselves have been rotated in and out of this conflict, depending on exactly what kind of message the Pentagon wanted to send at any given moment. Earlier in the war, after the United States reached a deal with the Houthis and talks with Iran were described by officials as encouraging, the Pentagon actually sent B-2 stealth bombers home from an airbase in the Indian Ocean and replaced them with B-52s instead. That swap looked, on its surface, like a modest de-escalation, trading the aircraft specifically built to penetrate contested airspace undetected for a bomber that operates more openly and depends on air superiority already being established. But it was never a full withdrawal of striking power, it was a substitution, keeping enormous bombing capacity in theater while adjusting the specific type of signal being sent. That pattern, swapping bomber types rather than fully removing them, appears again and again throughout this war. And it's part of why treating any single aircraft movement as definitive proof of a genuine shift in American intentions has repeatedly turned out to be a mistake. The forward basing itself matters just as much as which specific aircraft are sitting on the tarmac, because bases like Fairford in England, Al Udeid in Qatar, and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean all exist specifically to let American commanders generate a high sortie rate with minimal advance notice, meaning the actual constraint on how quickly this war can escalate again has never really been about how many bombers are physically present at any given moment. It's been about a presidential decision that can be made and reversed within days. Think about what this actually looks like from inside Iran's negotiating room, because the psychology here matters just as much as the hardware. For months, Iranian officials have been navigating an incredibly difficult position, trying to project enough strength domestically to avoid looking like they're simply capitulating to American pressure, while simultaneously trying to extract real concessions at the negotiating table that could actually end a war that's been devastating the country's economy, killing its people, and destroying huge portions of its military and nuclear infrastructure. When 6 B-52s visibly departed British soil in early July, that gave Iranian negotiators something genuinely valuable to point to. Tangible proof they could bring back to hardliners in Tehran that the strategy of enduring the bombing campaign and holding out at the table was actually working, that American resolve was cracking under the weight of a war that had already dragged on for months longer than anyone initially expected. That's not an unreasonable read of the situation, given what was publicly visible. But it also meant that when news broke barely a month later that an even larger strike, specifically targeting the country's energy infrastructure, had been fully built and was sitting locked and loaded, ready to launch. It didn't just represent a military setback, it represented a genuine credibility problem for exactly the negotiators who had been selling the earlier drawdown as proof their strategy was succeeding. Imagine being the official who stood in front of Iran's own government just weeks earlier, pointing to empty tarmac in England as evidence that patience and negotiation were winning, only to then have to explain why the United States nearly launched the single largest strike of the entire war days later. An attack so significant that it took 3 separate Gulf monarchs personally calling the American president to talk him out of it. There's also a piece of this that has never been fully resolved publicly, which adds even more uncertainty to how anyone should read the current lull. Even after all 6 B-52s left Fairford on July 1st, it remained genuinely unclear whether the Air Force intended to keep its remaining B-1 Lancers forward, deployed in Britain in case the diplomatic talks in Doha went sideways, or whether those aircraft would eventually follow the B-52s home as well. That ambiguity is itself revealing, because it means even the people closely tracking these deployments couldn't say with confidence whether the withdrawal represented a genuine strategic pivot or simply a partial drawdown designed to look more significant than it actually was, while leaving a real strike capability quietly in place nearby. When you combine that lingering uncertainty with the fact that American commanders can also launch B-2 and B-52 sorties directly from bases inside the continental United States, exactly as they did during the earliest phase of the war, the picture that emerges is one where a fully empty tarmac in England was never actually the same thing as an empty toolbox in Washington. The capability to strike Iran hard and fast never actually left, no matter how many bombers were visibly parked at any single overseas base on any given day. That whiplash also raises a much harder question. that Iran's leadership now has to reckon with heading into this week's renewed round of talks, which is whether any visible sign of American de-escalation can actually be trusted as a real indicator of where this war is heading, or whether every apparent pause should now be read as nothing more than a temporary operational lull sitting on top of a fully intact capability to escalate dramatically at a moment's notice. That's a genuinely destabilizing realization for any government trying to negotiate in good faith, because it removes one of the basic building blocks that makes diplomacy function in the first place, the ability to read your opponent's actions as reasonably honest signals of their underlying intentions. If bombers leaving a base doesn't actually mean what it appears to mean, then Iranian negotiators walking back into talks this week have to operate from a much more cautious baseline, treating every concession, every drawdown, every pause in strikes as potentially reversible within days rather than as a durable step toward an actual lasting peace. That's not a comfortable position for either side to negotiate from, but it's the position this specific sequence of events, bombers gone in July, the biggest attack of the war locked and loaded in August, has forced onto the table. It's also worth understanding exactly why the strike being planned for that first weekend of August carried so much more weight than the sustained bombing campaign that had already been running for months. Up to that point, the vast majority of strikes had targeted military infrastructure, missile storage sites, radar installations, IRGC command structures, the kind of targets that degrade a government's ability to fight without necessarily collapsing its ability to function economically day to day. A strike aimed specifically at energy infrastructure is a fundamentally different category of pressure, hitting the refineries, export terminals, and revenue streams that keep the entire Iranian economy breathing. That's precisely the kind of escalation that alarmed Gulf leaders enough to intervene personally and immediately, because instability in Iran's energy sector doesn't stay contained within Iran's borders. It ripples through the same regional waterways and shipping lanes that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar depend on for their own economic survival. When those three governments made direct calls to the American president, warning that this specific kind of strike carried a real risk of triggering broader economic shockwaves, they weren't speaking hypothetically. They were describing a threat to their own economies just as much as a threat to Iran's, which is exactly why the pressure to stand down came from them, rather than from Tehran, negotiating its own way out of the strike. There's also a broader lesson here about how modern wars get fought in an era where nearly every troop movement, every aircraft departure, and every satellite image gets picked up, analyzed, and broadcast globally within hours. Throughout this entire conflict, aircraft basing decisions have functioned almost like a public negotiating channel running in parallel to the actual diplomatic talks happening behind closed doors. A channel that both sides and every outside observer have been reading closely for signals about what's actually happening versus what officials are willing to say out loud. When the B-2 stealth bombers that had been sent home from an Indian Ocean air base were replaced with B-52s earlier in the conflict, following what was described at the time as encouraging talks with Iran and a separate deal reached with the Houthis, that swap was itself read as a meaningful signal, a shift toward a slightly less aggressive posture without actually removing American striking power from the region entirely. Every one of these movements, arrivals, departures, replacements, has carried this dual meaning throughout the war, functioning simultaneously as pure military logistics and as a form of strategic communication, that both governments understand the other side is watching closely. That's precisely why the sequence we just walked through, 6 B-52s quietly going home in July, followed by the biggest planned strike of the entire war, sitting ready to launch in August, lands with so much weight. It's not just a military story, it's a demonstration in real time of exactly how much daylight can exist between what a visible signal appears to mean and what the underlying strategic calculation actually is. There's a longer-term consequence to all of this that's worth thinking about too, one that extends well past however these specific negotiations play out this week. Every future crisis involving Iran, and honestly, every future crisis anywhere else in the world where the United States has forward-deployed bomber assets, is now going to be read through the lens of exactly what just happened here. Analysts, journalists, and foreign governments alike have spent years treating aircraft movements as a reasonably reliable signal of underlying intent, precisely because moving heavy bombers is expensive, visible, and hard to fake. What this specific sequence demonstrates is that even a fully visible, fully verified drawdown, 6 aircraft, photographed leaving in 2 separate waves, confirmed by multiple independent sources, still wasn't a reliable predictor of what happened next. That's going to make it materially harder for outside observers, and for the governments actually negotiating with Washington, to calibrate their own expectations going forward. Because the gap between visible military posture and actual presidential decision-making has now been demonstrated in the starkest possible terms. Bombers gone in July, the largest strike of the entire war, ready to launch in August. Governments negotiating with the United States in future crises are going to remember this exact episode. And it's likely to make them considerably more cautious about ever treating a drawdown as a genuine concession worth reciprocating at the table. Zoom out and think about what this means for how the negotiations resuming this week are actually likely to unfold. If Iran's negotiators walk into this round of talks believing that the mere threat of American military capability is enough to eventually force concessions purely through patience and endurance, the events of the last month should be seriously complicating that theory. The United States has demonstrated twice now in the span of about a month that it can credibly rebuild and ready its most significant strike options on short notice, regardless of what the visible troop posture looked like just weeks earlier. At the same time, the fact that this latest strike did get called off, and got called off specifically because of direct personal intervention from Gulf allies, rather than because of anything Iran itself did or said, tells you something important about where the actual leverage in this conflict currently sits. It isn't sitting primarily with Iranian negotiators at the table in Doha or Muscat. It's sitting with Gulf governments who have their own separate urgent economic incentives to see this war end, and who have shown they're willing to use direct personal diplomacy with the American president to prevent further escalation when they judge the risk to their own economies has become too high. That's a genuinely uncomfortable position for Iran to be negotiating from, because it means the country's fate in these talks may be determined less by what Iranian officials themselves are willing to offer, and more by how nervous Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi are getting about the broader regional fallout of continued escalation. So where does all of this actually leave things as negotiations resume? The honest answer is that nobody, including officials inside the American government making these decisions day by day, seems to have fully settled on whether this war is genuinely winding down or simply oscillating through another temporary lull before the next escalation. What we do know, based on the pattern of the last several months, is that every visible sign of American restraint throughout this conflict has existed alongside a fully intact, repeatedly demonstrated capability to escalate back to maximum pressure within a matter of weeks, sometimes days. The B-52s leaving Fairford in July was real. It happened, it was photographed, and it clearly meant something in terms of operational tempo at that specific moment. But it was never the whole story, and treating it as proof that American resolve had permanently cracked turned out to be a serious miscalculation once the plans for the biggest strike of the entire war surfaced just weeks later. Whatever comes out of the talks, resuming this week, that lesson is likely to hang over every subsequent signal both sides send each other, every troop movement, every aircraft departure, every pause in strikes, because both governments now have very recent, very concrete proof of exactly how quickly the picture on the ground can flip from apparent de-escalation to the edge of the largest military operation of the entire war. There's a human cost sitting underneath this entire pattern of escalation and drawdown that's worth acknowledging honestly. Because every time this cycle repeats, it's not just aircraft moving around on a map, it's real consequences for people living through this war on every side of it. Iranian civilians have spent months absorbing the fallout of a sustained bombing campaign that's damaged energy infrastructure, missile facilities, and government buildings across the country, alongside a domestic crackdown on protesters that human rights organizations have been documenting in real time. American service members have continued to be deployed, at risk, and in several cases killed, throughout a war that keeps threatening to wind down and then doesn't. And across the Gulf, ordinary people in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan have spent months living with the genuine possibility of missile or drone attacks landing near their homes, a possibility that spikes every single time this war escalates again. Every time the visible signal says de-escalation, whether that's bombers leaving a base or talks resuming in Doha, hope understandably rises across all of these populations that the worst might finally be over. And every time that hope gets undercut by news of the next planned strike, the credibility of any future signal erodes just a little further, making it harder and harder for either side to actually convince exhausted, skeptical populations that this time the peace talks are real. What do you think this actually means for how seriously we should take any future signs of American withdrawal from this conflict? Do you think Iran's negotiators genuinely believe the B-52 departure represented real progress? Or was that always understood internally as nothing more than a temporary operational pause dressed up for domestic political purposes? And do you think the fact that Gulf allies, rather than Iran itself, were the ones who ultimately talked Trump out of the biggest strike of the war changes how you read where the actual power in these negotiations currently sits? The honest takeaway is that the departure of 6 bombers was always a smaller data point than it appeared to be. One piece of a much larger, much more volatile picture that neither Iranian negotiators nor outside observers had full visibility into at the time. Treating it as a finish line rather than as one moment in an ongoing, oscillating standoff is exactly the mistake that made the events of the following month land as such a genuine shock. Let me know what you think in the comments below. This is exactly the kind of story where the details underneath the headlines matter enormously, and I genuinely like to hear how people are reading this sequence of events and what it says about where this war is actually headed from here. If this kind of detailed breakdown helped you understand what's actually been happening behind the diplomatic statements, drop a like. It makes a real difference in getting this kind of grounded analysis in front of more people who are trying to follow this war closely instead of just catching isolated headlines out of context. And if you want to keep tracking how these negotiations play out, because this story has already proven it can flip dramatically within a matter of weeks, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. And share this with anyone who's been trying to make sense of what all these bomber movements have actually meant throughout this war, because the next time you see a headline about aircraft leaving or arriving in the region, you'll know exactly how much weight that single data point can actually carry on its own. We'll be watching closely for the next signal, whichever direction it points, and we'll be back with a full breakdown the moment there's real movement to report. Because in a war that's shown this much capacity to reverse course overnight, staying informed as it happens matters more than ever. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.